The raging tempest had almost claimed another life, a woman and her team teetering on the brink of oblivion as their boat succumbed to the violent storm. Their fate seemed sealed until Thomas Riley, a fisherman shrouded in mystery, emerged from the chaos to perform an act of breathtaking heroism. But as swiftly as he saved them all, he vanished, leaving no trace for the approaching authorities. It wasn't until dawn broke the next morning that a Navy helicopter tracked down his fishing vessel, forcing him to finally confront the life he had so deliberately left behind. The storm was bearing down fast. Captain Thomas Riley, at 64, knew the sea intimately, and from the wheelhouse of his fishing trawler he could discern the ominous signs. A monstrous wall of dark clouds, an undeniable force, charging directly towards them. This wasn't merely bad weather. This was a tempest that would strike with brutal intensity. Second Chance was the name etched onto the weathered hull of his boat, a testament to the quiet irony of how a simple name could encapsulate a lifetime's unspoken narrative. Riley's hands, calloused and rough from years of toil, gripped the wheel with unwavering confidence as the waves surged, rocking the small vessel. These hands knew the precise dance required in a storm, skills honed long before he ever cast a fishing net, in a life he steadfastly refused to discuss. "Storm's coming faster than forecast, Captain," observed Miguel, the younger of his two-man crew, 32 years old, his finger pointing toward the now visible wall of black clouds on the horizon. Riley's reply was a low rumble, barely audible above the engine's steady thrum. "Weather service gets it wrong half the time out here. We'll finish this troll, then head back." Liam, his first mate of 15 years, glanced up from the sonar, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Could leave the nets? Come back tomorrow?" Riley shook his head slightly. "Fish we caught today feeds people tomorrow. We finished the job." Neither crewman argued. In the 5 years since Riley had purchased the aging trawler, after a lifetime spent working on other men's boats, they had come to understand that the captain's quiet determination was as immutable as the tides themselves. When Thomas Riley decreed a job would be finished, it was finished come hell or high water. What neither Miguel nor Liam knew was that Riley had spent 2 decades in the Navy before trading his uniform for commercial fishing gear. And he wasn't just any sailor. Riley had been a rescue swimmer, one of that elite few who plunge from helicopters into raging seas when a life hangs in the balance, and all other options have withered away. But that was a lifetime ago. Before the mission that went wrong, before the confidence drained from his soul, before he walked away from the very purpose he had trained for. It was precisely for this reason he had christened his boat Second Chance. It was exactly that, an opportunity for a new existence where the only person who could drown from his mistakes was himself. Sometimes, when storms like this one materialized, Riley would find himself observing the waves with an instinct far different from that of other fishermen. His mind would automatically begin calculating entry points, charting escape routes, assessing survival odds. All those ancient habits before he forcibly pushed the thoughts away, back into the shadows of his past. Riley checked his watch. 30 more minutes, then we haul in. The storm, however, decided to arrive in 20. The first squall line struck them with the force of a physical blow, sending sheets of spray across the deck and compelling Riley to tighten his grip on the wheel. Rain began hammering the windows of the wheelhouse, instantly reducing visibility to mere yards. The small trawler pitched and rolled with each monstrous wave, yet Riley's hands remained perfectly steady on the controls, making minute, almost imperceptible adjustments that kept them precisely perpendicular to the swells. "Captain!" Miguel's voice cut through the howling wind, urgent as he pointed to the radar screen. "Something big! 3 miles southeast!" Riley squinted at the display. A vessel significantly larger than their 58-foot trawler was undeniably drifting sideways in the mounting seas, a perilous position for any ship in such conditions. "They're not under power," Liam observed, wiping salt spray from his beard. "No wake signature." Riley's jaw tightened. The responsible course of action, he knew, would be to report the incident and continue on their way. His boat was not equipped for heavy rescue operations, and attempting to approach another vessel in these conditions could gravely endanger his own crew. The Coast Guard had helicopters, cutters, professionals with the proper equipment. But the nearest Coast Guard station was 2 hours away, and in seas like these, a drifting vessel could capsize in mere minutes. "Haul in the nets," Riley ordered quietly. "We're changing course." Miguel and Liam exchanged a quick glance, but moved immediately to comply. In all their years with the captain, he had never once deviated from a planned route, especially not with a full catch on board and such severe weather closing in. As they struggled to secure the nets in the heaving seas, neither crewman noticed the subtle yet profound change in their captain's demeanor. His movements became more precise, his focus more intense, his eyes constantly calculating distances, wave patterns, approach angles. For the first time in decades, Thomas Riley was thinking like a rescue swimmer again. On the radio, Riley reported their position and the drifting vessel. The Coast Guard acknowledged, confirming what he already knew. Their nearest assets were hours away. Meanwhile, the waves built to a terrifying 15 feet, each impact shuddering through the trawler's frame. As they drew closer, the vessel's identity became horrifyingly clear. The Oceanic Explorer, a 120-foot research vessel that frequented these waters, studying marine ecosystems. Through his binoculars, Riley could distinctly see figures on the rear deck, waving frantically. The research vessel was listing badly to port, its engines apparently dead. "They're taking on water," Riley muttered, more to himself than his crew. The Oceanic Explorer rode far too low in the water, its rail nearly touching the surface with each roll. "Captain, we can't dock alongside in this." Liam stated the obvious. "One wrong wave and we'd both go down." Riley nodded. "We'll pass close. Throw lines. Anyone who can jump will pull aboard." "And if they can't jump?" Miguel asked. Riley didn't answer. Instead, he began removing his heavy weather jacket and boots. "Sir!" Liam's voice carried a distinct note of disbelief. "You're not thinking of—" "Mind the helm," Riley interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Bring us within 50 feet, then keep station. I'll need you both on retrieval." Before either man could protest further, Riley was already moving toward the stern, expertly cinching a lifeline around his waist. Decades had passed since his last rescue swim, but his body remembered. The controlled breathing, the intricate mental calculation of currents, the focused calm that would soon take over. The second chance. Drew alongside the stricken research vessel, maintaining a safe distance while still close enough for Riley to assess the desperate situation. On the tilting deck of the Oceanic Explorer, 8 people stood, 2 appearing injured and supported by their colleagues. Behind them, the pilot house was already partially submerged. Riley raised a bullhorn. "We can take you off. Prepare to receive a line." A woman in a soaked yellow weather jacket, clearly the one in charge, responded through her own bullhorn, her voice strained. "Negative. We have injured who can't jump. Vessel's breaking up." Riley glanced back at Miguel and Liam. They watched him, their faces a mixture of concern and a dawning, profound respect. "Keep her steady," he called to them. Then, without another word, he dove into the churning sea. The icy cold struck him like a physical punch to the chest, but something extraordinary happened as he entered the water. Muscle memory kicked in. The decades fell away. His body remembered what to do, even if his mind had tried to forget. He timed his strokes with meticulous care, navigating through the treacherous troughs between waves. One wrong move, and he would be crushed between the 2 vessels. As he approached the research ship's hull, he could clearly hear the ominous groaning of metal, the dreadful sound of a vessel in its death throes. One by one, Riley helped the researchers into the water and guided them toward the trawler, where Miguel and Liam, with practiced efficiency, pulled them aboard. The injured went first, secured to improvised flotation devices fashioned from life jackets. The woman in the yellow jacket, who curtly introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Collins, went last, steadfastly refusing to leave until her entire team was safely off the doomed vessel. As the final researcher was hauled aboard the second chance, a massive wave struck the Oceanic Explorer broadside. With a sound like thunder, the research vessel's superstructure began to tear away from its hull. "We need to go now!" Riley shouted, urgently pushing Dr. Collins toward the waiting hands of his crew. "My research!" she protested, gesturing wildly toward the sinking vessel. 20 years of data! "Your life or your data?" Riley snapped, his voice resonating with the absolute certainty of a man who had seen the sea claim too many lives. The undeniable conviction in his tone broke through her resistance. She allowed herself to be guided to the trawler and pulled aboard. Riley was the last out of the water, hauling himself onto the deck just as Liam immediately put crucial distance between them and the rapidly sinking research vessel. For a moment, Riley remained on his knees, breathing heavily. The brutal cold water and intense exertion had taken more out of him than he cared to admit. 64 wasn't 30 anymore, no matter how well he'd maintained himself. Dr. Collins crouched beside him, her expression a complex mix of overwhelming gratitude and lingering shock. "You saved all of us. How did you—" She gestured at the raging sea they had just crossed. Riley rose unsteadily to his feet. "Just did what needed doing." He turned toward the wheelhouse, effectively ending the conversation before it even began. For the next hour, as they fought their way back toward shore through the worsening storm, Riley remained fixed at the helm, steadfastly refusing Miguel's offer to take over. The 8 survivors from the Oceanic Explorer remained huddled researchers huddled in the trawler's small galley, wrapped in every spare blanket and piece of clothing the crew could provide. Dr. Collins eventually made her way to the wheelhouse, steadying herself against the violent pitching of the small vessel. "Captain," she began, "I need to properly thank you. What you did, the Coast Guard said they wouldn't have reached us in time." Riley's eyes remained fixed on the churning seas ahead. "No need for thanks," Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. They wouldn't. I've been on research vessels for 15 years. What you did was extraordinary. She studied his profile in the dim light of the instruments. You've had rescue training, haven't you? It wasn't a question. Riley's silence confirmed her suspicion. My father was Navy, she continued. Search and rescue. He always said you could spot the swimmers by how they moved in rough water, like they were dancing with it instead of fighting it. She paused. That's how you moved out there. Riley adjusted their course slightly, his expression revealing nothing. Your team should rest. We'll reach Harbor Point in about 3 hours. Dr. Collins recognized the dismissal but stood her ground. At least tell me your name. For my report. Thomas Riley. Second chance. Out of Rockport. His tone made it clear the conversation was over. As promised, 3 hours later, the comforting lights of Harbor Point came into view. Riley steered the trawler toward the commercial docks, deliberately away from the Coast Guard station, where emergency vehicles could already be seen waiting, lights flashing in the pre-dawn darkness. Shouldn't we head for the Coast Guard dock? Liam asked. They'll have medical personnel for the injured. They can come to us, Riley replied. I'm not leaving our catch to spoil. The real reason went unspoken. Riley had no desire to face questions, paperwork, or, worst of all, recognition for what he'd done. He'd left that life behind decades ago, for good reasons. As they tied up at their usual berth, Dr. Collins approached him again. The Coast Guard will want statements. Probably the press, too, once word gets out. Riley secured the wheel, then turned to face her directly for the first time. You tell them whatever you need to. We're due back out in 6 hours once we offload and refuel. Her eyes widened. After what you just went through, that's insane. That's fishing, he corrected her. Tide and market, wait for no one. Before she could respond, Coast Guard and emergency personnel swarmed the dock. In the confusion of medical evaluations and excited researchers recounting their incredible rescue, no one noticed when the captain of the Second Chance quietly supervised the offloading of his catch, refueled, and filed a departure plan for high tide. By the time Dr. Collins looked for him again, the trawler was already disappearing into the morning mist, heading back out to sea. As Riley vanished into the mist, a significant chain of events was set in motion back at Harbor Point. The dramatic rescue hadn't gone unnoticed, and neither had the captain's quiet, almost surreptitious departure. Meanwhile, Thomas Riley had no idea what was happening back at the harbor as he pushed his vessel further out, his vessel back into the deep waters where he felt most at home. He had no clue that Sarah Collins wasn't just any marine researcher. She was the daughter of Vice Admiral James Collins, commander of the Navy's 7th Fleet. And she had already made a phone call that would change everything for the solitary captain. 6 hours after leaving Harbor Point, the Second Chance had reached Riley's favorite fishing grounds. The storm had passed completely now. The sea was calm under clear blue skies, as if apologizing for its earlier tantrum. His crew worked quietly, setting nets with the smooth efficiency that comes from doing something thousands of times. You did a good thing, Captain, Liam said, finally breaking the silence that had hung over them since they'd left port. Riley checked the sonar readings. We did our job. No different than anyone would. With respect, sir, that's not true. Liam's voice held an unusual firmness. I've been fishing these waters for 30 years. Never seen anyone dive into seas like that, especially not a man your... He caught himself. Age, Riley supplied, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. I'm old, Liam. Not dead. Experience, Liam corrected diplomatically. Most captains would have called it in and kept moving. Riley made a small adjustment to their course. Maybe they should have. Miguel, who had been silent until now, joined them in the wheelhouse. Captain, I've got to ask, where'd you learn to swim like that? For a moment, it seemed Riley wouldn't answer. Then, surprising even himself, he did. Navy rescue swimmer, long time ago. His crew exchanged glances. In 5 years, this was the most personal information their captain had ever volunteered. What made you stop? Miguel asked, then immediately regretted it when he saw Riley's expression harden. Nets need checking, Riley said, effectively ending the conversation. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully as they worked, the familiar rhythm of fishing providing the comfort of routine after the previous night's chaos. It was approaching noon when Liam, squinting at the horizon, called out from the stern. Captain, aircraft approaching fast. Riley stepped out of the wheelhouse, shading his eyes against the sun. The unmistakable silhouette of a military helicopter was visible against the blue sky, growing larger by the second. Coast Guard? Miguel suggested. Riley shook his head. Naval. The helicopter, a Seahawk, slowed as it approached, hovering about 50 yards from the trawler. Through his binoculars, Riley could see naval insignias and the number 7 painted on its side. 7th Fleet. Something cold and heavy settled in his stomach. They're hailing us, Liam called, pointing to the radio in the wheelhouse. The Marine band crackled to life. Fishing vessel. Second chance. This is U.S. Navy Seahawk Foxtrot 79er. Do you copy? Riley hesitated, then picked up the handset. This is second chance. We copy. Captain Riley, we've been dispatched to verify your condition following last night's rescue operation. Please stand by. We're sending down our rescue swimmer to assess before... Riley could protest. A figure dropped. From the hovering helicopter, executing a perfect dive into the calm sea. The swimmer, a young woman in full rescue gear, cut through the water with powerful strokes, reached the trawler, and climbed aboard with practiced ease. She removed her helmet and gave Riley a crisp salute. Petty Officer First Class Jensen, sir. Permission to come aboard. Riley nodded stiffly. He clearly wasn't comfortable with all this formality. Granted. Though I don't know why you're here, we're all fine. Jensen looked around quickly, taking in the trawler and its small crew. That's not the only reason I'm here, sir. She reached into a waterproof pouch and pulled out a sealed envelope. I was instructed to deliver this to you personally. Riley took the envelope, turning it over in his hands with obvious reluctance. The seal belonged to the commander of the 7th Fleet. Inside was a brief handwritten note. Captain Riley, my daughter Sarah told me what you did. We've been looking for you for a long time. There are things you should know. I'll be at Harbor Point Naval Station tomorrow at 0900. I hope you'll be there too. James Collins. Riley read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. Admiral Collins. The name brought back memories he'd spent decades trying to forget, of a stormy night much like the previous one, of a rescue gone wrong, of a commanding officer who'd shouldered the blame that should have been Riley's. Sir, Jensen's voice broke into his thoughts. I need a response. Riley looked up at the hovering helicopter, then at his crew, who watched with undisguised curiosity. Tell Admiral Collins I'll think about it. Jensen nodded, clearly expecting this answer. There's something else, sir. We've been asked to escort you back to Harbor Point. Escort? Riley's eyebrows rose. We're not in any danger. Those aren't my orders, sir. Jensen's expression remained professionally neutral. We're to accompany you to ensure safe passage. Translation. They weren't giving him the option to disappear again. Riley glanced at his nets, his crew, the open water around them. For a moment, he considered refusing. It would be simple enough to continue fishing, to ignore whatever ghosts from his past were trying to resurface. But he'd been running for 20 years. Maybe it was time to stop. Set course for Harbor Point, he told Liam. We're heading in early today. During the 4-hour journey back to port, the Navy helicopter maintained a constant presence overhead, occasionally circling but never straying far from the trawler. Riley remained in the wheelhouse, his expression unreadable as he guided his vessel homeward. Must be quite a story there, Captain, Liam observed carefully. Riley's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. Just the Navy being the Navy. Always had a flair for the dramatic. As they approached Harbor Point, Riley saw something that made his hands tighten on the wheel. The docks were lined with people, far more than the usual fishermen and dock workers. And in the naval section of the harbor, a sleek destroyer flew the distinctive flag of a vice admiral. Looks like we've got a welcoming committee, Miguel said, a note of excitement in his voice. Riley said nothing, but his jaw clenched visibly. This was exactly what he'd hoped to avoid. Attention, questions, reminders of a past he had deliberately left behind. For a brief, irrational moment, he considered turning the trawler around and heading back to sea. Then, through his binoculars, he spotted a familiar figure on the dock, a woman in a yellow jacket, Dr. Collins. Beside her stood a tall man in a naval uniform, adorned with the insignia of a vice admiral. James Collins had apparently decided not to wait until tomorrow. As the second chance approached its birth, the crowd on the docks parted. Dock workers moved forward to catch the lines Miguel and Liam threw, securing the trawler. Throughout the process, Riley remained in the wheelhouse, watching through the salt-streaked windows. Finally, when he could delay no longer, he stepped onto the deck and then down to the dock. The crowd fell silent as he approached Admiral Collins and his daughter. Collins stepped forward, looking much the same as he had 20 years ago, perhaps more gray at the temples, a few more lines around the eyes, but still standing with the straight-backed posture of a career naval officer. Thomas, Collins said, extending his hand. It's been a long time. Riley took the offered hand briefly. Admiral, I think after all this time you can call me James. A flash of annoyance crossed Riley's face. I'd prefer not to do this here, he said quietly, gesturing at the onlookers. Fair enough. Collins nodded to his daughter, who stepped forward. Captain Riley, she began, her voice carrying clearly to the assembled crowd. Last night, you and your crew risked your lives to save 8 researchers from certain death. The Oceanic Explorer sank completely less than 20 minutes after you took us off. She paused, her expression solemn. There is no question that without your intervention we would all have perished. Riley shifted uncomfortably. We did what anyone would have done. No, Sarah Collins said firmly. What you did required exceptional courage, skill, and selflessness. On behalf of everyone aboard the Oceanic Explorer, I wanted to thank you publicly." She gestured to the crowd, where Riley now noticed the other researchers standing together, bandaged but smiling. Admiral Collins spoke next. "The Navy recognizes extraordinary heroism, whether it comes from those in uniform or civilians. Your actions exemplify the highest traditions of maritime service." "I'm just a fisherman," Riley said, his discomfort growing with each word of praise. "No, Tom," Thomas Collins replied quietly. "You're a great deal more than that, but we can discuss the rest privately." Somehow, Riley endured the next 30 minutes of handshakes, thank yous, and well wishes from townspeople he'd known for years, but had rarely spoken to. Through it all, the Collinses remained nearby, the Admiral occasionally deflecting questions that seemed to make Riley particularly uncomfortable. Finally, as the crowd began to disperse, Collins approached again. "My quarters on the destroyer. 1 hour. Just to talk." Riley hesitated, then gave a single curt nod. When he boarded the destroyer an hour later, freshly showered and wearing the one clean shirt he kept for shore visits, Riley felt a visceral sense of displacement. 20 years had passed since he'd set foot on a naval vessel, yet everything felt instantly familiar. The smell of paint and metal, the disciplined movements of the crew, the muted sounds of equipment and voices. Collins met him personally, leading him to a private wardroom rather than his formal quarters. It was a considerate choice, less intimidating, more neutral ground. "You disappeared," Collins said without preamble once they were seated. "After the inquiry cleared you, you just vanished. Took me years to track you down, and by then, you'd made it clear you wanted to be left alone." Riley's expression remained neutral. "I believe my resignation letter was quite thorough." "Thorough, yes. Accurate?" "No." Collins poured coffee from a carafe, sliding a cup toward Riley. "You didn't fail that night, Thomas. You saved 4 lives in conditions that should have killed everyone involved." 3 people died, Riley countered, his voice flat. "Including your executive officer. Commander Hayes was my responsibility, not yours. He knew the risks when he ordered that rescue attempt." Collins leaned forward. "You've been carrying guilt for something that wasn't your fault." Riley stared into his coffee cup. "With respect, Admiral, you didn't call me here after 20 years to absolve my conscience. What do you want?" Collins sighed. "Always direct. I've missed that." He reached into a folder and withdrew several photographs, sliding them across the table. "I want you to look at these." The photos showed young men and women in naval rescue swimmer gear, training in rough seas. In one image, a helicopter hovered as a swimmer descended toward churning waters. "The rescue swimmer program has changed over the years," Collins continued. "New techniques, better equipment, but the core mission remains the same. Saving lives." "Saving lives?" Riley said quietly. "Yes." Collins studied him carefully. "We're establishing a new training facility at Harbor Point. These waters, with their unique currents and conditions, make it ideal for advanced training." Understanding dawned on Riley's face. "You want me to train your swimmers?" "I want you to consider it," Collins corrected. "Not full-time. You could keep your boat, your crew, your life exactly as it is, but twice a month, you'd share what you know with the next generation." Riley was already shaking his head. "I haven't been in the program for 20 years. Whatever I knew then is outdated now." "What you did last night suggests otherwise," Collins countered. "Sarah told me how you moved in that water. Some skills never fade, Thomas." Riley stood abruptly. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in returning to that life. I'm a fisherman now. You're both, Collins said simply. You always have been. Last night proved that. Riley moved toward the door, then paused. Why are you really doing this, James? Guilt? Pity? Respect? Collins replied without hesitation. And because the Navy lost something valuable when you left, I'd like to get a piece of it back. Riley left without answering, the weight of the past and the unexpected fork in his future hanging heavily between them. The next morning, as Riley prepared the second chance for another day at sea, he found both his crewmen waiting at the dock alongside a familiar figure in naval uniform, Petty Officer Jensen from the helicopter. Captain, Liam began awkwardly. We've been talking about yesterday. Riley continued his pre-departure checks. Not much to talk about. Actually, sir, there is, Miguel said. Jensen here told us about the training program, about you maybe teaching part-time. Riley's hands stilled on the fuel gauge. That wasn't a settled matter. We think you should do it, Liam said firmly. Both of us, even if it means adjusting our schedule. Riley looked at his two men who had stood beside him through storms and lean seasons, who had trusted him with their lives countless times, without knowing his past. Why? He asked simply. Miguel gestured toward the sea. Because what you did out there should be passed on, sir. Jensen stepped forward. The first training group arrives next week, Captain Riley. 8 candidates. They've all heard about what you did during the storm. She hesitated. It would mean a lot to have you involved. Riley looked past them toward the open water, then at the naval destroyer still anchored in the harbor. For 20 years, he'd defined himself by what he'd left behind, carrying the weight of perceived failure like ballast in his soul. 1 session, he said finally. I'll do 1 training session and see how it goes. The relief on their faces was immediate and gratifying. As Jensen departed to report his decision, Liam and Miguel returned to their preparations with renewed energy. Alone in the wheelhouse, Riley unfolded Admiral Collins's note, reading it one more time before carefully placing it in the small box where he kept his most important papers. Fishing licenses, his boat registration, and a faded photograph of a much younger Thomas Riley receiving his rescue swimmer certification. As he guided the second chance out of the harbor, he spotted a small group on the naval dock. Admiral Collins, his daughter, and several uniformed personnel watching his departure. Collins raised a hand in salute, a gesture Riley acknowledged with a brief nod. The trawler passed the harbor entrance, meeting the first swells of the open ocean. Riley felt the familiar rhythm of his vessel responding to his hands on the wheel, to the water beneath its hull. A dance he'd performed thousands of times in 2 very different lives. For the first time in 20 years, those lives no longer seemed entirely separate. 3 weeks later, a small ceremony was held at the Harbor Point Station, marking the completion of the first rescue swimmer training course. In attendance were 8 newly qualified swimmers, their instructors, and Admiral Collins himself. Also present, though standing quietly at the back, was Thomas Riley,